that list you were talking about of 30 to 20, 30 albums, whatever you want to do next year, you will feel the passion for the right ones. You know, the top 10 or 12 will, and you'll think, no, now's the time. We have to. The universe is telling us we have to do that one.
Yes.
Or it's Ron's anniversary. We have to do that. You know, John McLaughlin says no. Let me at him.
Yeah.
You know? So it is a passion project, isn't it?
It is completely.
And people don't. A lot of people don't quite understand that, do they, John?
No. But we do, as I said earlier, we do get an awful lot of congratulatory messages. I mean, seriously, there's 6 or 7 people who, every time they buy something, they don't just click the buttons on Bandcamp, PayPal, and buy it, and the order comes through automatically by email. I also get another side email from them, just said, you know, I've just bought your so-and-so. I'm loving what you're doing. Keep up the good work.
Fantastic.
You know, and these are coming from all over the world. These
Fantastic.
are coming from all over the world.
You're not wasting your time, John. And, you know, hopefully I'm not either. You know, because, you know, there's so much. In a way, you know, I feel my personal view is I feel we're coming to the end of, well, I'll put it in a different way. I feel that there was peculiar circumstances in the latter half of the 20th century between music and commerce and people being interested in music as a central part of their life and everything. And transactions allowed people to have careers in music and to achieve things, which are now, I think, more challenging. I think it's more challenging now to be a professional musician, and I think for reasons of economy, climate, international politics, Brexit, all sorts of things, it's more and more challenging for international touring to happen, for people to have a viable touring lifestyle. Streaming means there's really no money in music, or unless you're occupying a very particular niche, as you are, for example, in terms of physical sales to a very devoted fan base. So for all of these reasons, I feel that we're kind of coming to the end of what you might call the rock era, or the era of music as a mainstream viable commercial entity, and people touring and so forth. And I think music there's always, of course, still the demand for music, but it will become, I think, more localized, and people will produce recordings kind of more for souvenirs or as art projects, as opposed to, you know, in the way it was done in the 60s and 70s and 80s and so on. So in a way, we're kind of mopping up at the end of the party.
Yes, you know? That's a good way of putting it. I like that. Yes.
But speaking of mopping up at the end of the party, you have a fantastic release. This, I think, is one of your most extraordinary releases. And the reason I think it's extraordinary, I mean, beautifully presented.
Again, this is so 3 CDs at the back.
Yeah.
These were from cassette tapes.
Yeah.
That I was given by Trevor Watts.
Yeah.
And I lent him that Revox B77. So he wanted to transfer some of his 1980s material. First of all, he came to my house with another chap does a guy called Nick Dart, who's got a high forehead records, and he's done a lot of re-releases of John Stevens albums and Spontaneous Music Ensemble, and he's worked with Trevor for years. And Nick brought Trevor to my house down south, and we transferred one session from a reel-to-reel tape, made a digital transfer. And then Trevor said to me he had a lot more, and he said, you know, any chance of using your machine again? And I said, Trevor, I'll lend it to you. And he lived down in Hastings, so and he said, what? I said, I'll lend you my Revox B77. And he said, that's not normal behaviour. People don't do things like that. Well, I do.
Yeah, of course.
Because I, like what you were saying earlier, it needed to be done.
Yeah.
This needed to be done. And this was...
Grab the moment.
So I drove my Revox B77 recently serviced down to Hastings, plugged it into his Apple Mac, showed him how to use it. And then in the alcove of his roof space, his attic studio, he had a whole alcove full of reel-to-reel tapes. So he just started working through those. He had my machine for 2 or 3 weeks, and he transferred a lot of stuff, which he then became albums, I think, with Nick's label, High Forehead. But when I was there, I'd been sent on a mission by Simon Spillett, we've been talking about, the Tubby Hayes biographer. He said, John...
To misdirect Trevor and rummage through his tapes, Mark.
He said, make sure you... no, ask Trevor if you can have the Splinters tapes.
Oh.
And he said, but be careful, because I know Trevor doesn't think much of that. 1973?
72, 73?
72, 73 is about 6 gigs with this band called Splinters, which was like the first super group of British progressive jazz, where you had the free players and the more post-bop players. So you had like Tubby Hayes,
John Stevens,
Kenny Wheeler, Trevor Watts, John Stevens, Phil Seaman playing across the opposite side of the stage, and then Jeff Klein on bass and Stan Tracy on piano. So you had this sort of Stan, Jeff Klein,
we're in the middle,
Seaman, and you had the freer players out there as well. And he said, see if you can get the cassettes off Trevor, because Trevor Watts, he used to take a professional cassette machine with stereo microphones and put it on the front of the stage. So all the gigs he did at all the famous pubs in South London and places, and the Bull's Head and all these places, and all the hotels they used to play around London, he recorded all onto cassette. So I warned him beforehand. I said to Trevor, look, I'm interested in those Splinters tapes. And he didn't mention it at all. And I'm down there, and we're working through his big archive of his more interesting stuff to him. And just as I was about to leave, he just kind of, as a casual aside, said, oh, over there, sitting on top of the edge of the piano, he said I pulled out these Splinters tapes. He said, I said, oh, can I have them? I was that sort of, humble. I said, oh, can I have them? He said, yeah, they're for you. He said, you can do whatever you want with them. Wow. I'm not interested, really, in seeing this. I was thinking about that music again from that particular period of time. So I came back. We had transferred them, and we tidied them up, the sound. They need quite a lot of work doing to them. Anyway, and we produced, and then we got Simon Spillett to write who was in Seventh Heaven at this point.
No better man.
With this Tubby Hayes material that no one had ever heard before, but lots of people remember going to these performances.
And of course, we should say it was pretty much at the tail end of Tubby's life.
Yes.
It was. I mean, he died that year.
He died that year. So one of these would have been one of his last performances.
Yeah.
One of these sessions at the summer of '72 would have been one of his later performances.
And of course, completely unique repertoire.
Completely improvised music.
And it's a beautiful art. The reason I've asked you to kind of get this out of the shelves is because it's a beautiful physical artifact. And I think you and I are both people who are interested in some of the releases you do are download only. But we're both interested in the physical.
I'm not really interested in download onlys at all.
Well, me neither, to be honest.
We see them. I just see them as a means to an end. When we've got something that we think is really interesting for a probably small group of people, but not worth spending all that effort on an album. But at the same time,
I mean, I've bought a couple of the Alan Cohen Big Band is fantastic, for example.
Now that's possibly one where it does justify
Borderline.
An album release, and I think we might have in that not even on the list of 20. I think we've got a lot more Alan Cohen material.
Well, that's a rabbit hole we'll not go down.
But anyway, so the pictures are fantastic, and of course, what happened is these all came from the fantastic photographer Jack Kilby, who basically was the guy on the scene.
I've met Jack,
and I think at one point Trevor actually lived in his squat. So they were, and Jack used to drive John Stevens and Trevor Watts to gigs.
It says something, doesn't it, about the economic situation of British jazz in the 60s and early 70s, that one of the leading free improvisers of the day is squatting on the floor of a jazz photographer. So like the jazz photographer is like just about able to afford a flat.
And Trevor told me that the only reason he now has a house in Hastings is because when he was in that squat, a woman in the audience took a shine to Trevor, and she was already had a professional career, and she owned a flat, and they got together.
Wow.
And that's the only way Trevor Watts would ever have been able to afford to have his own house.
Yeah, wow.
So, but
I mean, nobody goes into jazz for the money, really.
But Jack Kilby has got the most awesome. Zach, his son Zach, has got access, and his wife holds the archive of all the negatives for these. So you just have to. I go to Zach and I say, Zach, there were 3 Splinters gigs, and he looks through the database and he says, oh yeah, I've got sort of. All these photos from those. So we pay for those.
Yeah,
that's one person who, we make sure the people who need to, who are like, people who it's their living. It's their living.
No, I agree with you. Actually, I agree entirely. I've when Zach was alive, I licensed some of his photos for my John McLaughlin books, and I had the pleasure of meeting him in London. We went for a curry and we had a great old time. Lovely fella. If you did nothing else, I think that project, hats off to John Thurlow.
Do you know, there's been a few projects like that where
there's a lot of hats off to John Thurlow.
So, no, currently, at the moment, Jazz in Britain is just two people. It's me and a chap called Pete Woodman.
Yeah.
He's
who knew?
Yeah, exactly. And he does the graphic design.
Yeah.
He also edits our books.
Yeah.
He works incredibly hard. He's a meticulous worker, proofreader, editor, brilliant. We think we've got the best job in the world, actually.
Yeah.
Can you imagine?
I think you do.
doing this all the time, every day. And it's just, and so, I do understand.
To be honest, if my mortgage was paid off, I'd be, if not in your chair, I'd be in a similar chair over the sea.
I've got quite a lot of pensions, and the mortgage is paid off.
Happy days.
So we can I choose what I do. But what I was going to say is there's been a few albums we put out where I've said to myself, I can't better that.
Yeah.
So why don't we stop now? I jokingly say to Pete, why don't we stop now? Because you can't get any better. But the next one always ends up being better.
Yeah.
And and this job, I've always been I'm a glass half full guy. I'm a born optimist.
I'm a glass half empty guy, actually, which I've got a kind of a feeling of kind of, damn it, the world's going to end, but this has to get done anyway.
No, I've always a morning person. I can't work very late. I'm the opposite. I always jump out of bed with a smile on my face, looking forward to what's going to happen. Look forward to what I've got to do that day. I've got to a point now with Jazz in Britain where we strictly choose what we want to do. Yeah. We won't be put under pressure by anybody at all. We don't want to argue with anybody about anything. We won't. If someone shows any resistance to something, we'd say, okay, fair enough, we won't do it.
If the door isn't opening, just go to another door. Absolutely. But of course, in a way, you don't. Not everything you have in your archive needs to come out on Jazz in Britain. You've been very generous to projects that a couple of projects that I've been involved in with, for example, Repertoire, the 13-disc Nucleus at the BBC set, and the 14-disc Barbara Thompson box set. A lot of that material came from your archive.
Yes. Yeah.
So you're pretty. It's not about.
No.
It's all about John Thurlow. It's like, I've got this material. Somebody else wants to make it available. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Fill your boots.
And again, there's some stuff we've got in the archive that isn't the sort of thing we would release ourselves, but we know other people would.
Acker-Bilk?
Acker-Bilk is one. Actually, I don't think we've actually got an Acker-Bilk recording in the archive. I think in the Colin Drury tapes, there is one Acker-Bilk session, but I haven't digitized that one.
Heaven prevent. Actually, he was pretty good, Acker, wasn't he?
Oh no, he was brilliant. Yeah. And I know I think his son is. Is it his son? Yeah, he's active on Facebook trying to.
It's kind of funny. Back in the day, we should say the reason. British modern jazz in the '60s was such a tight little scene and it was like the underdog. I think people forget how colossal traditional jazz was circa the 19s. Those couple of years before the Beatles.
Yeah,
you couldn't move for light entertainment shows having on the likes of Acker-Bilk and Terry Lightfoot and Kenny Ball and all these people. That was the pop music of the day. This peculiar blend of working class.
No, it's not Acker-Bilk's son. Sorry, you wouldn't use this anyway. But it's Kenny Ball's son, who's very active on social media, trying to, as it were, correct the retrospective view of his father's playing.
Well, I couldn't really comment on that, but that era of.
But it was real light entertainment. It was. Yeah.
But it was peculiar and distinctly British as well, because it wasn't just New Orleans playing. It was New Orleans music from the 1910s that had somehow gone through the filter of English music hall and pantomime by the time it ends up on light entertainment shows circa 1960. So you have all these guys wearing these unusual outfits and this sort of variety artist kind of patois and playing knees up Mother Brown with banjos in the style and clarinets and stuff. Very, very peculiar, unusual. Again, we're back to Australian wildlife. Peculiar entities that kind of crop up in an unusual location, distant from the source.
But the example of the sort of music jazz in Britain wouldn't put out, I've given Bill Lesage sessions to, I think, rhythm and blues records.
Well, a little bit too mainstream.
Yeah. And
mainstream with a capital M, as in not quite modern jazz. Yeah.
But no, what a wonderful thing to be able to do this. And so I do feel incredibly lucky, and I know a lot of people would die to be able to do this.
Well, I suppose so. And I was going to say the final point I suppose I wanted to make was, I feel there's a lot of people who kind of are doomsayers about physical music and on physical carriers. Personally, I can't see if music is going to be physical. I get the vinyl revival and the kind of the hipness of that and so on. For me, the compact disc is still the gold standard in terms of sound quality in a physical musical form, and the kind of the fact that physical forms like your Splinters box set or indeed just a standard digipack with a booklet, the amount of space it offers for the whole history, the context, the essays, the photographs, all of that, it tells a whole story, and it's part of the package. And I think you and I are kind of believers in the physical music entity for all that can be put into it. Do you see a future for physical music? Is there 10 years in it, or will it keep going? Have we kind of reached the bottom of the the whole streaming thing? Where are you at with that?
No, I don't know. I don't.
Yeah.
I sort of, part of me is thinking, I've never really asked that question, but I have sort of thought about it, because I know another good friend of ours who runs Discus Music, Martin Archer, based in Sheffield, who he's put out nearly 170 albums of new music.
Yeah.
He was interviewed recently for a sort of podcast, and he basically said that his intention was to go completely downloads and streaming only, because he didn't want the physical faff of, because he does all his own distribution of shipping everything out of himself and having his loft full of boxes of CDs. So
I can imagine there comes a point where the novelty of that wears off.
But no, people. I mean, people like me and you who like the booklets with all the photographs and that. There's no one coming up to replace us. Put it in that way. We are probably a dying breed now.
Yeah, we're the ants.
Yes,
we're the ants of the musical ecosystem.
Yeah, so there isn't probably anybody coming up to replace it. So it probably does have a limited lifetime now, and it probably is about 10 years. Thinking about the age of the people who I know.
You never know, because the thing is, in a way, quality will out. One of the other things I'm interested in is classic British crime from the Golden Age, the period between the two wars. And certainly when I became interested in that in the 90s and early 2000s, you just there was no reprints of anything. The occasional thing, the occasional collection of short stories, but very, very little of that material, bar endless reprints of Agatha Christie, was being republished. Now the British Library are 200 books into a series on classic British crime republications, with essays by Martin, introductory essays by Martin Edwards, who's a great anthologist of that genre, and other publishing companies are putting stuff out. Harper Collins, no relation, are doing the Freeman Wills Crofts canon. He's a Northern Irish crime writer from the 20s and 30s. And again, you know, I had bought all of his second-hand books that I could afford via and find via eBay. And then, you know, just as I almost have them all, HarperCollins, it becomes trendy, and they're all, you know, coming out. But so look, that's well, I suppose the reason I deviated into that is that, you know, you never know. In 10 years' time, there could be a sudden interest in physical music with great packaging and stories.
Yeah.
Because you know, after 10 or 20 years of streaming and just music as a background thing, you know, a larger amount of people may think, gosh, investing a bit of time in this is interesting. Oh, look, there's a book. You know, just never know. We can't predict it.
No.
That being said, we could be as dead as a dodo in a couple of years.
Yeah, indeed.
But you'll still have a nice room.
Yeah.
You'll still have a nice room in your entire collection. So this is the Jazz in Britain warehouse, which is, of course, a corner of John Thurlow's garage, which is, making good use of space, I think. And amazingly, the one album that John put out that I haven't yet got that I really wanted was this one by Henry Lowther's Quaternity. And as if by magic, there is literally one copy left. Literally one copy left. And I will, on this one occasion, accept a freebie. So yeah, welcome to the glamorous world of not-for-profit record label warehousing.